Welcome back. I'm so excited. It is Friday today. We have a lot of snow here in Nova Scotia, and so I figured I would put on my festive, fun Friday shirt, and that is why the colors are chosen that they are for the video that we're going to go over this week. I thought it would be really fun to do a Q&A with some really common questions and some typical advice that I would give some of my clients. I pick some questions that I get in my messages. Primarily, I would say TikTok is really overwhelming, but in my Instagram one and by email, and especially in my school community, some of these questions have come from there. These are really common ones that I get asked. And so I figured what better way than on this festive Friday day to go over some Q&A questions. So let me share my screen with you. I am a visual person, so I find it a lot better if we can have a visual way to go about things. Okay, so question number one. So these questions are all going to come around fertility and pregnancy, and I think that these can be really helpful to go over. So this first one, I was wondering if you have more content on estrogen's place in all of this. I'm a breastfeeding mom. I would love to conceive again 2 years postpartum now, but I don't have my cycle back. From your work, I'm learning that I am likely not consuming, or now I think not, consuming enough retinol, copper, and magnesium, so I've started to implement these changes in my diet. Do you have more content on estrogen's role in all of this? I had blood work done and I am producing almost no estrogen and progesterone. My LH and FSH were on the high side. I also saw that my cholesterol was higher than expected for my age of 33. I would love your insight. So I feel like there's a whole bunch of moving parts there, lots of different things that we could unpack. But when we have previously had a baby, it's really important whether or not we had that baby to full term. That's going to actually be really important when we think of us or our children or our partner's health, whoever's health we're trying to learn a little bit about. In the last 6 weeks of the pregnancy, baby gets a bolus of copper. So baby's liver has 10 times more copper than our liver does when they're born. And that's important to know because the pregnancy is really demanding on copper. Most people think that they're low in iron, but the body actually gives way to copper. And we have something called hemodilution, we have an increase in estrogen. All of these different things make it so that our iron drops while we're pregnant. That's physiological, that's what we want to happen. If somebody doesn't have their hemoglobin dropping while they're pregnant, would be concerned with that. So I say that because depending on how many children this person's had, whether they've just had one, is going to have an impact on their copper status. And each baby that we have, we will, theoretically lose more and more copper as baby gets the first pick of nutrients. And the next child isn't going to have the same amount. So if, for example, we've been taking a synthetic multivitamin, and I say that because unless it's like beef liver or oyster powder or cod liver oil or these things that are naturally occurring like herbs, unless it's like that, if we are not having that, then it's going to be synthetic, and that's how our body's going to look at it. It's not just that we pee it out, that's not what happens. It goes into our body and it can disrupt how iron's moving. So the role that estrogen plays in all of this. So I kind of want you to picture like a bell curve. That when, I think a bell curve makes the most sense. I should have done a diagram for this. But when iron is regulated, that means that we are going to have hormonal balance, because in order to balance, in order for iron to move, we need ceruloplasmin. That's one of my favorite things to talk about. It is a master antioxidant in the body. A lot of people get hung up on glutathione, but ceruloplasmin takes the cake. And part of why that's important is because when our body doesn't have enough ceruloplasmin, then what is our body going to use? It's going to use estrogen. And so that's why it's really common for a lot of women to have high estrogen, because the body is using that as a way to try and regulate iron. It's trying to reduce some of the stress, the oxidative stress that the body's causing. I hope you're still with me there. So when we're thinking of hormones, think of it in the most simplest terms, that our body can make hormones, but it can't make minerals. And so in order to move iron, we are going to need minerals in order to do that, bioavailable copper being one of them. And when I say bioavailable copper, that's a really important distinction from just copper itself, because a lot of people will think, well, copper is toxic. I had really high copper. No, it's not toxic. It's not bioavailable, and that means we need ceruloplasmin, and that also means that we need vitamin A, especially in the form of retinol. So estrogen's place in all of this, kind of like how does that come into play? And something that I think is really important, I'm going to pull up some of my notes here to make sure I cover off the different points. But part of why that's really important is when our hormones are imbalanced, then that's a sign that our minerals are imbalanced. And we don't have to go and get estrogen testing done. The body runs on minerals and hormones, the body runs on minerals, and hormones are going to help make sure that that there's optimal absorption. I think that's an easy way of thinking of it, because a lot of people think in terms of absorption. And so our menstrual cycle isn't just estrogen, it's not just progesterone. If we don't have enough progesterone, then it's showing that we don't have enough magnesium, likely don't have enough B6. And if we're low in copper, then that means that the yin to that yang has to be that we have more iron. And so if there's not enough copper enzymes, like ceruloplasmin, to regulate that, then estrogen can be used. And so when I'm saying that, I'm saying, typically high estrogen would be the role in that. But when our body is depleted, I'd say in both, then that's a sign that our body is really depleted in minerals. So when we're thinking of that, for example, I think a lot of the time we want to look at things and think, well, if I'm high or low, then it has to mean this. A lot of the times, though, what it can mean is that if you're high or low, then it can mean that there's an imbalance, and that's how your body is coping with that stress. So it doesn't have to mean that, like, if your estrogen is high, that means your iron's dysregulated, and if your estrogen is low, then that would mean the opposite. That's just simply not the case. How our bodies are going to fluctuate with our hormones, and the same thing can go with testosterone, can come back to our minerals. And I think something that's really important that she said was that her cholesterol was higher. So there's a few different moving parts to that. One, I think that depending on the country that we live in is going to depend on the high optimal range, or the highest number that cholesterol will fall under. Europe is going to use a different number than, say, North America will. And that's important because I also think that cholesterol is part of our body regulating iron. So when cholesterol is a little bit higher, it depends how high it is, but I also think that part of that is a physiological response to regulating iron. So for example, let me put that into perspective. When we have iron, oxygen, and water, and we have the three of them interacting, the body it needs to stop that somehow. And if we don't have copper, we don't have bioavailable copper to regulate the iron, then we can take that iron away. So now we have oxygen and water. Well, cholesterol is like a sinkhole for oxygen. It's going to gobble up 11 molecules of oxygen to make 1 unit of cholesterol. And part of why that's important is because iron can be regulated through our feces. And our feces are going to be made up of bile and cholesterol. So if our cholesterol is higher, then we can look at that as a sign and say, hey, iron's probably not moving as optimally as it should be. And so that's something that we want to take into consideration, because it means that there's lots of pressure on our feces, on our stool. That would be how men would regulate their iron, how children would regulate their iron, how somebody, a woman who stopped menstruating would regulate iron would be through feces. And that means that there's a lot of pressure on our bile and a lot of pressure on our feces to make sure that we are pulling that out. Now, whether or not it's as optimal as bloodletting, I don't know. I don't think so. It doesn't make sense for me to think that that would be the optimal number, because there was a study that I was reading about where they took rats and they were looking at where iron was building in their body. They focused on the liver, and they found that in the liver particularly, it was the bile ducts, and they wanted to see how much iron built up there. It was something like 20 times higher than the rats who didn't have iron that was given to them. And then when they were looking at what they were excreting, it was only 4 times the amount of I can't remember if it was bile, cholesterol, or if they were measuring iron in the stool. I can't remember which one it was, but it was 4 times higher. And so when you think of that, that it's plus 20 times higher that's accumulated in the liver, and we're only excreting, or the rats were only excreting 4 times the amount, that means that there's still a large amount that's building in our liver. And so part of why bloodletting can be so beneficial is because that's going to make sure that we are removing some of that iron, but we're also really after the EPO that the body is going to release. That hormone comes from the adrenal glands, and that's going to say, I kind of picture like a little drill sergeant, like almost like Lord Farquaad, going to like one organ, and he's like, release the iron. And then he's like, regulate the iron. We want that hormone. That's what doping scandals are about, is about EPO. And so that's what we're after. We're after that when we have a hemorrhage or we have a heavy blood loss, like through bloodletting or blood donation. So my first thing that I would look at, if this was my client, is I would look at doing some blood donations. Blood donations are one of the fastest ways, and if you're against blood donations, then do some form of bloodletting. I know that in the US, you can have a phlebotomist who comes to your house. You can choose the amount that you want of blood that you want to lose. That's something to consider. But when I think of my clients who have had, I had one client in particular, she had anywhere between a 70 to a 90-day cycle overall. And so she was not losing very much blood, obviously. She never had 2 back-to-back ovulated like tracking since she had started tracking. And within doing, I think it was 3 blood donations, she was able to get under her belt. She had 2 back-to-back, and she became pregnant on the 3rd. She had 2 back-to-back, like confirmed ovulations, and then went on to get pregnant. So if I was looking at that, I would think that if this was my client, I would say consider some form of bloodletting. Consider going, if you're, queasy about needles, I would say look at going to acupuncture and starting that way, getting more used to the needles. Sometimes they can even do some form of bloodletting that way. It's called wet cupping. That could be an option. Things like that would be a good way to go about doing it. Retinol, so looking at cod liver oil, copper for sure, some beef liver, different beef organs. I'm a huge fan of beef spleen in particular, because I think that when we eat the organs that we want to improve, then it helps us improve the organs in ourselves, if that makes sense. So in northern Canada, the Aboriginal people, the first thing that they used to do when they would kill an animal was eat the eyes of that animal. They would do that because it would help their own eyes. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And if we are able to get some liver and spleen, I think that's helpful. The reason why I like liver itself is because it's rich in copper, but that doesn't mean that there's not benefits to other organs as well. And magnesium, absolutely. So if this was my client, I would look at getting some kind of baseline established with the amount of supplements that we're taking, because diet alone isn't going to be enough. If it was, then we wouldn't need supplements. Part of the reason why we need supplements is because our soil is depleted. And just like if the soil is depleted for the nutrients for us, then when we're consuming animals, then it's also going to be depleted for those animals, because they're eating the nutrients that are coming out of the soil, the grass and whatever have you, and they're simply not getting the amount that they used to as well. So I think supplements are really beneficial. If you wanted to start off with just diet alone, that could absolutely work. Then looking at making sure that we're getting cod liver oil, beef liver, I would say an adrenal cocktail for sure, because there's stress going on in the body when we are, if we're looking at a hormonal balance perspective, then that means that we're likely having oxidative stress, and some support for our adrenal glands would be really beneficial, especially if we're wanting to look at getting into some realm of bloodletting or blood donations, what have you. We want to make sure that our adrenal glands are nice and supported to make sure that that goes well and that our body releases more EPO. So adrenal cocktails are huge. And then I would say those would be the 3 big focuses that I would look on for sure. I mean, this isn't to say that focusing on the male perspective of fertility. And that's absolutely important, but we're just going to stick with the question. And something that's important is when we are breastfeeding, we are really depleting ourselves in vitamin A. So if we're still breastfeeding, something to think about is the importance of vitamin A rich foods, especially vitamin A in the form of retinol. So the cod liver oil, the beef liver, really, really important to make sure that we are actually getting enough, because baby's taking a huge amount, and it also depends on how much we're breastfeeding. I think this is a great opportunity to show you drink meats, salty fashioned. So this is an adrenal cocktail. There's different ones on the market that you can get, but this one has acerola cherry, pine, reishi, shiitake, sodium, and coconut water to help support the adrenal glands. But there's some different reasons why I like the ingredients in this. Is that's all that's added. There's nothing else to it. It tastes earthy, so with other adrenal cocktails, the taste can be quite difficult to palate, to get that down. But I really like that there's shiitake in it, primarily because that helps our body produce, or it gives our body choline. So when we're thinking of producing enough bile in the body, that can be really important. Choline is also really important when we're talking about baby's brain development, when we're talking about regulating iron, especially when we're pregnant, as there's a lot of perspectives around not having enough choline, and one of them being Lily Nichols. Loved her forever. And when she's talking about fertility and pregnancy prep and what we should eat when we're pregnant, that a lot of the times we aren't getting enough choline. And I think that that's probably because, one, baby's brain needs it, but also because when we stop menstruating, there's a higher demand that's put on choline to make sure that we are producing enough bile to regulate that iron. And I think that that's really important. So I really like that the adrenal cocktail this one has B vitamins. I will add a link at the bottom of the show so that you can check it out. Okay, so I think there's a lot to unpack there, but that's where I would start. Keep it simple. Okay, question 2. I feel like postpartum healing slowed down as a massive dip in energy, eye bags, always cold, and more. 2 months postpartum from C-section. So that totally makes sense, because especially if we are breastfeeding, there's a huge demand that's happening, and it can be that higher demand than when we were pregnant. So that's an important consideration on why we can just feel so depleted, because we've just had these 9 months of growing this beautiful baby, and depending on where our minerals were when we started the pregnancy, where they were, how much stress we were under while we were pregnant, it can really have that dip. So the eyes are really important because they connect back to our liver. So if we are thinking of how to improve our overall health, then our eyes can give us a huge indication of what's going on internally. And our liver isn't going to be able to give us pain and say, hey, I need some support. It's not like we can feel it like we would our heart if we were having heart palpitations, different things like that. But our eyes can tell us about our liver. So something to keep in mind is that if we're having bags underneath our eyes, then that can be that one of the first places that iron accumulates is the liver. So that can be a sign that we need to start getting some of the iron moved out of the liver. Now, if we're 2 months postpartum, we're likely, it's not the same situation that we would be in if we were like the previous question where we're 2 years postpartum. So we're not going to be running out and going and doing a blood donation, but something that can be really helpful is making sure that we're having warm foods. So warm foods warm the spleen. And the spleen has a massive role in when we're talking about iron's movement and regulation, especially because it's part of the lymphatic system. And that's where copper is meant to be. It's meant to be in our bone marrow, which is part of the lymphatic system. So if we start focusing on warm foods so that the body doesn't have to warm the food before it breaks it down, making sure that we're chewing our food should be the consistency of applesauce before we swallow it, making sure that we, always cold has a role in that too. Another thing that I would find would be helpful is an adrenal cocktail. I used to struggle with Raynaud's in my breasts, which was incredibly painful. and I found that I was always cold. I found that adrenal cocktails really help with that because it has sodium, potassium, and this one has magnesium from the coconut water in it. So just that little bit of extra balance can be beneficial to help make sure that our fluid is moving more optimally through our body. And making sure, so we're having the warm foods and drinks, nothing like straight out of the fridge. That means no smoothies for breakfast. That means if we have the ability to, making sure that as warm, as like basically as warm as possible. It doesn't have to be like scalding hot, but just nothing that's super cold. We want it to be just warm a touch. Making sure that we are looking at what we're consuming in our bodies would be part of that too. What we're consuming around us has a huge part in our postpartum period because it can be a really vulnerable state for a lot of us. So making sure that we're surrounded with people that are wanting to support our overall well-being is really important. And if you have red light can be really helpful. If we had enough copper, then red light wouldn't work, but red light can be really beneficial for helping with healing too. And I would look at some kind of, like on top of, obviously I love adrenal cocktails, cod liver oil, beef liver, magnesium. Those are like my favorites. But I would look at some form of cell salt to help with that. So maybe some Califos, if there had been like some vitamin D consumption in the past. Califos can be helpful for dusting off those potassium receptors and helping make sure that our fluid is moving more optimally. So it's kind of where my mind is going with that. But as much sleep as possible. I know that's like, it feels like an impossible task with a newborn, but if there's any ability to have, some friends or some family come over just so that you can rest, that would be really beneficial as well. Okay, question 3. So this one, I wanted to take it from the point of pregnancy prep. So, and also then what happens when we become pregnant. So what is the optimal level of ceruloplasmin, especially if you have heavy anemia and heavy periods? So we want ceruloplasmin at 30, but looking at ceruloplasmin as 30 is not telling us the whole story. Because when we are measuring our ceruloplasmin, unless we were part of a study like a rat in a lab, we aren't going to see how much of that ceruloplasmin is available. And so what that means is ceruloplasmin, getting that number, is basically like seeing how many buses a city owns. It's not telling us how many are out for maintenance. It doesn't tell us whether or not we have a driver for that bus. It doesn't tell us whether or not one of them was involved in a collision that day. It's just telling us how many buses the city owns. And why that's important is because we want to know, it's only telling us how many buses the city owns, not what is actually operational. And that's important because we want to know how many are actually active. And so if you have somebody who's like a root cause protocol consultant, who's able to look at the blood markers and help figure out where that stress is building in the body, it's not looking at the point being, we don't want to just look at one marker because it's not telling us the whole picture. Just looking at ceruloplasmin isn't telling us what's going on elsewhere. So you would want to look at copper. You would want to look at also vitamin A. You would want to look at vitamin D because you want to try and see with the whole picture where the stress is in the body and how your body is handling that stress as to whether or not copper is being made into its bioavailable form. So especially if you have anemia and heavy periods, the number isn't going to change. But the heavy periods and anemia, that's your body trying to regulate itself. That's your body being really smart, and it's trying to say we have too much iron in the tissue. So what we want to do is, remember that EPO that I was talking about, is the more blood that we can lose through our womb, then that means that we can release more EPO. And that means that we can release more iron that's in the tissue. Because when we have anemia, most of us aren't having biopsies done of our liver or figuring out where the iron is in the tissue. We're just looking at the blood. And if the iron isn't in the blood, that doesn't mean that it's not in the body. And that's a really important distinction. So when that would be pregnancy prep. The heavy periods and anemia is a good thing. We are not broken as women. We do not need birth control to try and regulate it. We need more minerals in our body. And the heavy periods is from our body trying to say, hey, I need a little bit of extra support here. Can you help me out? I'm trying to lose more iron. I'm trying to regulate it. Because not only do we want to move iron, but we want to remove iron. And those are two really important points. So when we become pregnant, where this is important, is the optimal level of ceruloplasmin is going to change. And so is the optimal number of copper. Because remember what I was saying at the beginning, how our body gives way for more copper and ceruloplasmin when we're pregnant. And so you can think of pregnancy like two phases. We have the first half and we have the second half. And when we're thinking of the first half of pregnancy, that would be before the placenta takes over. So we're thinking of 20 weeks. And, this makes, I would say, like just the most sense to me when you're breaking down kind of why different things are done at certain points. So the reason why the gestational diabetes test is done around 24 to 28 weeks is because the placenta recently takes over there. That's when it's going to start up and become active. So we basically have before the placenta is in full gear, and then we have when the placenta is in full gear. And I think that's like significant because the placenta runs on copper. There's 3 enzymes that are copper dependent, and what your body does is it changes the amount of iron that it has circulating, which is going to come up in blood work and show that you're low, but you're not low because we're comparing what a non-pregnant woman should have compared to a pregnant woman, and that's not the case. And I say that because there was a study with 153,000 women. The best birthing outcomes for mom and baby were when mom had a hemoglobin of 8.5 to 9.5 or 85 to 95, depending on what unit of measurement you're using. So we want our iron to drop when we're pregnant, same as ferritin. Ferritin is not where all of your iron is stored in your body. And I haven't seen anybody with a ferritin above 10 when they are like at the kind of later half of the pregnancy. So that to me would mean that part is physiological. How the like diluted ferritin plays a role in it, I'm not sure. I haven't put my finger on that yet. I don't know if I have an answer that can fully explain it, but I know that if I'm seeing women who are having that as their normal, then to me that means that's also physiological. And it would make sense when copper is given the priority because that's what baby wants. Remember the last 6 weeks of the pregnancy, that's what baby is going to need. So when we're looking at the optimal level of ceruloplasmin, ideally we want ceruloplasmin to double and we want our copper to double or triple. And that's really important because if we're looking at the numbers and we're thinking, well, this is high, we're looking at it and saying it's high because we're looking at non-pregnant women and comparing them to pregnant women and not understanding what's happening while somebody's pregnant. So I hope that you found this beneficial. I hope that you found it helpful. If you have questions that you want to see, you can absolutely add them below, send me a message. I would love to hear from you. And yeah, I am going to work on what the topic will be for next week. But if you have any questions, this link will be down below and you can check out the Drink Neat Adrenal Cocktail. Thanks so much. See you soon.